In a wonderful, if little-known travel book called Following the Equator, Samuel Clemens, known to all of us as Mark Twain, commented firsthand on Australia's colonial community in the mid-1890s. Memorably, he observed,
"Australian history is almost always picturesque. Indeed, it is so curious and strange that it is itself the chiefest novelty the country has to offer. It does not read like history, but like the most beautiful lies."
This was a comment from Twain as perceptive as it was sparklingly original. But what the celebrated American novelist would not have known is that his words held as much truth applied to one of his own countrymen residing in Federation Australia 100 years ago as for anyone else in the distant southern continent at that time. King O'Malley, insurance agent, real estate agent, colonial politician, Commonwealth politician, orator, tall tale teller, finance guru, charmer, defies easy description. He was a genuine one-off. In 1888, at the age of, possibly 30, he came to Australia to stay, and he died in Melbourne just before Christmas 1953, leaving a healthy estate. O'Malley was accorded a state funeral as the very last survivor of the Commonwealth of Australia's celebrated First National Parliament of May 1901. This first Parliament included a cluster of future prime ministerial stars: Edmund Barton, Alfred Deakin, Chris Watson, George Reid, Andrew Fisher and Billy Hughes. And of course, one king. O'Malley may have been 95 when he died, but we'll never know because he had to claim in Australia that he had been born in a British Empire country, in this case Canada, in order to stand for an Australian Parliament. He told a lie, a beautiful lie, that everyone in Australia was in on, for all knew that King O'Malley was born in the United States. It would not be the first time, and far from the last, when, recalling his checkered past, the American prudently reverted to constructive falsehood. But how do these quirks of background and behaviour entitle King O'Malley to be singled out for special treatment a century and more later? The answer lies in this historic footage, directed by the doyen of the Australian silent film industry, Raymond Longford, and elegantly filmed on Canberra's birthday just on 97 years ago, on the 12th of March 1913. On the podium that day was Australia's 5th Prime Minister, Andrew Fisher, a firm favourite of Kevin Rudd, as well as Lord and Lady Denman, and the Labor federal government's highly controversial Minister for Home Affairs, the American King O'Malley. As one Australian contemporary noted, on that dusty autumn day, and despite the elite company, O'Malley stood by the side of the stone which he was to lay, planted his right foot on it, folded his arms and surveyed the beautiful sweep of country in front of him. Mr. King O'Malley stood there like a king, monarch of all he surveyed. And when O'Malley stood like a king, he stood on these very foundation stones on the 12th of March 1913. He is a fundamental part of early Canberra history. He was a showman, King O'Malley, and he knew it and he exploited it for every single cent it was worth. But mention the name King O'Malley to most Canberrans today and it's a pretty fair bet that they'll say it's a pub right here in the middle of the city. This pub, established in the year 2000 and a very popular meeting place for most Canberrans. Let's go and have a look. The reason we have such an entertaining testament to a highly talented, if flawed man, is King O'Malley's publican, Peter Barclay.
I think he's probably the most flamboyant and interesting politician Australia's ever had. I read the Arthur Hoyle book on King O'Malley and I got really interested in his history. And most people in Canberra probably wouldn't know much about him. He was an enigma, a really interesting person, and the more I researched into his life, the more fascinated I became. He was the one who started Canberra. He put the first peg in the ground, the survey peg that started Canberra off as Minister for Home Affairs. The more I looked around, the more I found the desire to research into his life. Dudley Drew painted King O'Malley for the Commonwealth Bank in 1953. It's an interesting story. He painted it over a 10-week period. He went to the house in Albert Park and he had to help King O'Malley get dressed and sit up and have his tie on and look very, very formal for this portrait. But it's now ended up in the boardroom off the Commonwealth Bank in Martin Place in Sydney. I saw the portrait and I was really intrigued about the artist because he wasn't a well-known artist. I hadn't heard of him before, and I did some research and managed to get in contact with him. He lives in Victoria, and over a period of time I got to know him, and I said, look, would you feel comfortable to do another portrait of King O'Malley? And he said, yes, I will do it. I will do it, because that was my first major commission. He said, look, I'm not going to make a reproduction of what I did for the Commonwealth Bank. He said, what I want to do is a portrait of what he really looked like.
And that's the one that we've got over
your right. This is the one
right
behind us.
There are no less than 3 biographies of O'Malley. The Hoyle book is by far the most reliable, but if we judge according to the rigorous standards of contemporary biography, that is scarcely a compliment. The Larry Noy volume is a frustrating mix of misprints, pagination gone wild, big slabs of quotes, errors of fact and errors of judgment. And the problem with the Dorothy Katz book is that Dorothy was just too close to her charismatic and charming subject. And this is one of the reasons why this man is such an enigma to the detective biographer today. Those strange, carefully crafted lies about his past, to name a few. No, he did not live in this cave in Queensland when he first arrived in Australia. No, he did not get befriended by an Australian Aborigine called Kuwonga. And no, he did not walk from Rockhampton to Adelaide and through Tasmania. Poor old Dorothy Katz, friend and biographer, swallowed these big fibs hook, line and, I'm afraid, sinker. But what do we know? Well, we know for sure that soon after his arrival in Australia, O'Malley visited Melbourne for that city's massive international centennial exhibition in the last months of 1888. An Australian journalist covering the big event years later recalled the eccentric American O'Malley, who apparently represented himself at that time as the Arizona Kicker King. We also know for certain that in the 1890s, O'Malley spent time in the West Australian goldfields, mostly in Kalgoorlie and Coolgardie, where he made good money. And we know that he went from there to South Australia to reside. The frontier style of colonial politics in Australia at that time had immediate appeal to O'Malley. And when he ran for office for the first time in the South Australian House of Assembly elections in April 1896, he was elected as one of the 2 members for Encounter Bay. The results surprised many of his rivals, but as history would show, it shouldn't have. The O'Malley star under the Southern Cross was rising quickly. In 1901, after nearly a year campaigning for one of the Tasmanian seats in the first Commonwealth Parliament, and again, to the complete surprise of many, O'Malley was elected. Mainland Australian newspapers were gobsmacked by the new arrival on the national stage, this upstart American aberration. Melbourne's Punch newspaper felt insulted. King O'Malley represents the most eccentric development in Australian democracy. The basic principle in his dealings is, what is there in it for O'Malley? Now, such comments did him no justice, for there was much more to O'Malley than self-aggrandisement. His main supporters were the hulking, no-nonsense miners of West Coast Tasmania. They took a real shine to his democratic extravagances, his bravado, his love of a scrap, and his cheek. One young eyewitness remembered him in the early political days, getting out of the train in Queenstown, Tasmania, with characteristic panache. Queenstown, Tasmania loved O'Malley's speeches. They were rich entertainment, especially those delivered from the balcony of Hunter's Hotel. Fortunately, this building is beautifully restored for us today. It appears that many Australian women, exposed to the O'Malley charm, were not agape. They were positively aflutter. O'Malley gave their lives a bit of Hollywood before Hollywood had begun. Again, one contemporary journalist who observed this phenomenon at work for the first time at the 1888 Melbourne International Exhibition and at later political events was in no doubt that early female suffrage in Australia was the key to the Americans' success. As he wrote, "It was not till lovely woman secured the vote that the real genius of O'Malley was recognised and rewarded. There is victory in the eye of this man. His whiskers breathe confidence. His bosom is a perpetual invitation to the stricken deer." But if the women of early Federation Australia swooned, a significant number of O'Malley's male political colleagues, Conservative opponents and fellow Labor Party members alike, recoiled from his more outlandish behaviour. The Labor Party's first three Prime Ministers, Chris Watson, Andrew Fisher and Billy Hughes, O'Malley's party colleagues, regarded him with a suspicion bordering on dislike. But they could not ignore him. Popular within the Labor caucus in the Fisher government of 1910 to 1913, O'Malley had the numbers to obtain a ministry despite his leader's misgivings. And since this government served a historic full term with majorities in both houses, O'Malley, as Minister for Home Affairs, had the opportunity to promote some of the causes closest to his heart. Among them, old age pensions, a government-owned and run bank, the rights of women, and, courtesy of his Bible Belt background, temperance. O'Malley hated the effects of strong drink. For him, it was nothing more than stagger juice, as he always called it, a blight on the community fabric which should be eradicated. King O'Malley had the Home Affairs portfolio for the majority of the time between 1910 and 1916. In other words, as the choice and progress of Canberra as the national capital was being heatedly debated in the Parliament in the lead-up to and aftermath of 1913, it was O'Malley in the driver's seat. Prime Minister Fisher wanted the issue done and dusted as soon as possible. O'Malley, on the other hand, accepted the challenge with relish. He threw himself into the job, as his fascinating diaries, now in the care of the National Library of Australia, show us. It's also worth noting that despite O'Malley's enthusiasm for Canberra in these key years, in the beginning he was no advocate of the Canberra option as the national capital. In spite of being the mover of the inaugural motion to create a capital in July 1901, O'Malley at that time was happy to bask in the urban amenity of Melbourne, with its museums, galleries, exemplary parliamentary facilities, and perhaps the best racecourses in Australia, maybe even the world. He loved a punt. But the capital story quickened appreciably in 1902, and with it, O'Malley's interest. In 1903, he came out strongly in favour of Bombala, at one point telling the House of Representatives in a flurry of cold climate myth rhetoric,
"If ever there was a spot set apart by the Creator to be the capital of this great Australia, it is Bombala. The history of the world shows that cold climates have produced the greatest geniuses."
7 years later, as Minister for Home Affairs and after scoping the Yes Canberra option with his own eyes, in September 1910, O'Malley lectured the House about the wonders of Canberra.
New South Wales is the Empire State of the Commonwealth, and we desire to have a city that will be the Gotham of Australia. Yes, Canberra occupies one of the highest situations in New South Wales. I slept there in a tent last June and felt in the morning that I had awakened to a new world.
O'Malley wanted more for the capital of his adopted country, demanding that the intended 900 square miles plus of federal territory would not be freehold land, whereas in Washington DC, the real estate sharks had a field day with inflating prices. For O'Malley, the New World egalitarian Australian capital city must comprise only leasehold land. Land, as he said in his 1901 House motion, that would forever remain the property of the Commonwealth, the property of all the people of Australia. And that's why we are all leaseholders in the ACT today. While O'Malley did not leave a permanent legacy of prohibition for the residents of what was then the Federal Capital Territory, he did go perilously close. In fact, the 1st of January 1911, the very first ordinance of the Federal Capital Territory was to make the FCT alcohol-free, to make it dry. And that would last for the residents a full 17 years to 1928. The FCT citizens were sick of driving to Queanbeyan to get a beer, and they overturned that prohibition ordinance in a referendum. In the build-up to Canberra's Grand Centenary in 2013, King O'Malley's prominent place in the early history needs to be reaffirmed. He moved the first visionary motion to create the capital. He took an active role in the Battle of the Sites to find a capital. He piloted the issue through the national parliaments, mostly as the Minister for Home Affairs, and in that capacity, he took complete and controversial control of the international competition to design the capital. A competition, as you all know, won by two Chicagoans, Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Mayonnaie Griffin, in May 1912. When King O'Malley stood on this podium, he was using this golden trowel. He was indeed the monarch of all he surveyed. But the trowel, you'd have to say, is a sacred object. But of course, the importance of today, the privilege for me today, is that this is the first time that this object, this sacred object, this part of the national treasure, it's the first time that it's been brought back to the foundation stones since 1913. It's now in the pictorial section of the National Library of Australia, and I feel very honoured to be holding the trowel today. The speech he gave that day is not in the top rung of his public utterances. But the good news, the great news, is that the National Film and Sound Archive has a historic recording of the speech that O'Malley made in 1937 when he was in his late 70s for posterity. He never missed an opportunity for self-promotion. I'll leave you with a sample of this national treasure.
Your Excellencies, Lord and Lady Denman, I thank Her Excellency, Lady Denman, for christening the capital Canberra. Today, the 12th of March, 1913, we are assembled around those commencement columns on Capitol Hill, Canberra, made famous through having been